It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Labour MP Hilary Benn, Reform Party leader Richard Tice, editor-at-large at The Guardian, Anushka Asthana, and political strategist Joe Tanner. Today.
This is not normal. This is the dystopia which I stood here and forecast on the day we went into lockdown.
Not everyone was happy, but MPs voted overwhelmingly to extend COVID restrictions in England. Why are they so popular?
Are you hopeless, Mr Hancock? I don't think so.
Is Matt Hancock hopeless, Prime Minister?
Turmoil at the top of government. So why aren't Labour prospering?
Every hour looking through CVs, looking for people that I can offer interviews, and we're still, it's just not working.
Do we need more immigrants to fill vacancies? Let's start with this story in the Daily Telegraph and show our viewers and guests in the studio the headline, Return of Holidays if you are vaccinated. This is a report that people who are fully vaccinated could go abroad to amber list countries and return to the UK without the need to quarantine. My opening question to all of you, starting with you, Hilary, is that a sensible policy?
Well, the first sensible policy would be to sort out the mess of the list system. I don't understand why we have amber list countries that we can go to, but we're told by the government we shouldn't go to. So that is the first thing. We'd like to scrap amber, and you should have red and you should have green. And then secondly, what has the scientific evidence got to say about whether it is safe for people to go and come back, even if they are double vaccinated without quarantine, because reports today of the extent of asymptomatic infection amongst people who are double jabbed. So I'd like to see what the assessment is. And finally, I see on your excellent website that a government source said we have no plans to do this.
Well, it hasn't been ruled out, let's put it that way, but you're absolutely right. That was the official response. Richard, the scientists have said that the vaccines, particularly if you're double or fully vaccinated, offer very high levels of protection. So would that be a sensible policy, allowing those to go abroad and return without quarantine to those countries?
I think so. Look, we've had a fantastically successful rollout of the vaccine programme, but now the government seems to be more petrified than ever. And so we're not taking advantage, whether it's the unnecessary continuation of the restrictions, the ability to travel when you've been double vaccinated or when you have a PCR test. We've got all the benefits of the vaccine programme, but we're utterly failing now to take the benefit. And I think it's really going to hold us back. And when you look at the evidence around the world, you look at what's going on in states in America, you know, they've fully opened up. There's no increase in hospitalisations or deaths. We should take advantage. We've got to have the courage to learn to live with this virus and to live with it now.
Anushka, what do you think? Not everyone, of course, has had the chance to be vaccinated or not fully vaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, holidays are in a way the elephant in the room. They're trying to get things back to normal, but in 2021, we're far more restricted than we were in 2020 when it comes to actually travelling abroad. And ultimately, they're going to have to find a way to allow people to travel somewhat. And so this suggests that they're looking for ideas as to how to do that. I did notice within the Telegraph that the ideas, as you say, weren't necessarily as simple as that. Some were saying maybe it's just for people returning, but also there was a question mark on whether kids would be included or not. I mean, if kids are included, then that's no holidays for people with families, which is going to, you know, feel quite difficult. I mean, clearly they do need to try to solve this, but we also know that borders are increasingly important when it comes to keeping this out. I guess the big question is, will those other countries want to take us? Because, you know, the EU this week hasn't added the UK to its white list, I think it's called, because they're very worried about what's happening here in terms of infections.
And Joe, do you think it would be a sensible policy?
It would be a sensible policy if the systems work. And my theory is that actually we've had years of NHS IT failures, And I, for one, had my jabs back in January and February because I was volunteering. And my records have gone astray. So I wouldn't be able to travel because although I've had 2 jabs, I'm being chased for a 3rd, which I'm not sure what that would do to me. I have visions of looking like the Ready Brek kid if I do have the 3rd. But I actually wouldn't be able to travel because it turns out that the first jab they missed in January, the batch number apparently expires. So they can't even upload my record at present because the batch number will not be allowed on the system. So I don't know what happens to someone like me, and I would not be able to travel under the current system that's being proposed.
Well, there were questions about people who are vaccinated and people who haven't taken up the vaccine, even if they've been offered it, in the debate yesterday on COVID restrictions. Let's have a listen to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, responding to a question from Liam Fox.
The duty that we have when somebody has not been offered the vaccine is greater than the duty we have when we have offered a vaccine but somebody has chosen not to take it up. And there is a material difference between those two situations that I think my right honourable friend was getting at.
What do you make of that comment, Richard?
I thought that was an extraordinary comment, absolutely extraordinary. The suggestion that the NHS is going to discriminate between people who've been vaccinated as opposed to those who, for whatever reason, have exercised their freedom of choice not to vaccinate. The whole point of the NHS, for which we pay our taxes, is that it's there to cure us, to protect us. Look, we've done our bit protecting the NHS at a time of deep crisis. We now need the NHS to protect the population, everybody. And the idea that you discriminate, I think, is utterly, utterly appalling. And those who are discriminated against, they might justifiably say, well, why should I bother paying my taxes if you're not going to treat me when I'm ill?
Hilary?
Well, it wasn't entirely clear from the clip what kind of discrimination was being referred to in Matt Hancock's answer. But clearly, when it comes to access to NHS services, there should be no discrimination whatsoever. But it is also the case that we have a vaccine. We're now increasingly seeing the evidence of how effective it is. And I think all of us have an obligation to take it because, and it's great to see young people queuing up now as it's being rolled out to the much younger age groups, because it's not just about whether I'm going to get seriously ill, and younger people have looked at the stats and worked out, well, I don't have to worry too much. It's also about protecting your loved ones, your family, your parents and your grandparents. And we've just got to keep getting that message across to encourage people to come forward, because, as they said during the G7, until everyone is vaccinated, we're not all going to be protected. So it's not just about what happens here in the UK. And I regret there isn't currently a plan for the 10 billion additional doses are required to make sure that everyone in the world gets one. And by the way, on Joe's problem that she was referring to earlier about her vaccine record, to make any international travel system work, you're going to have an agreed international vaccine passport, for want of a better phrase. And you're going to have data that's accurate so that countries have confidence that when someone says, I've got proof of my vaccination, that it's accurate.
Right. Now, the COVID restrictions were extended, as we said at the beginning of the programme, for another month at least by a healthy majority in the House of Commons yesterday evening. There was, though, a sizable rebellion of mainly Conservative MPs. One of the leading rebels is Steve Baker. Let's take a listen to him.
We can't tolerate a situation anymore in which a government social scientist told the author of the book A State of Fear that the government had used unethical techniques of behavioural science to deliver a policy which he said, in his own words, smacks of totalitarianism. We have transformed this society for the worst. We have put in place a culture and habits which will take years to shake off, culture and habits which distance people from one another and diminish their quality of life, the quality of relationships that they have with one another.
Right. I mean, do you think, Hilary, that the government scared everyone to death?
No, I think in eventually taking the decision to lock down, the government did the right thing. There is a reason. I don't agree with Steve Baker, because there's a reason when you look around the world at the approach that many, many, many countries have taken using lockdown and restrictions to prevent the spread of the disease. And that did buy us some time. And thank goodness for the scientists, because the great triumph of this pandemic has been the way in which the scientists have delivered fantastic vaccines in ways that we probably wouldn't have thought was possible at the start of it. And there is a responsibility on government to protect the public. And when you saw the pictures from the hospitals in Italy, I mean, how could anyone look at that and say, no, we don't need to do anything here? It would have been utterly irresponsible.
Richard?
I think that the government said in the roadmap that it was about data, not dates. But the reality is the data is good. The data is better than any of the scientists believed possible when they launched the roadmap. And the truth is that there has been a significant difference between the number of infections, which is mainly amongst the young, and the number of hospitalizations, the number of people in hospital, and the number of people sadly dying, which is now down, averaging around single figures. 40 times the number of people die every single day. I think half the population have been scared, and the other half of the population is furious that these restrictions have been eased.
Anushka?
Well, I think there are various reasons why people in Britain have actually been quite pro-lockdown and have tended to support restrictions. I think the terrible death rate. I actually think the moment in which Boris Johnson himself ended up in intensive care had an impact on the way people felt. I also think the way people feel about the NHS. It was an incredibly powerful thing to tell people to do things in order to protect the NHS, and they wanted to do that. James Johnson, the pollster and former strategist, was arguing that these points actually are why people support lockdown restrictions, and also the fact that we don't have a large populist party that is making an argument against it. Yes, sure, we have the 50 MPs who voted against Boris Johnson yesterday, but the leadership of most of the parties is quite pro-lockdown. Of course, people are increasingly desperate to get back to normality, and it is true that rates are very low at the moment, but you have to look at the projections as well. The Delta variant is on the increase. I had some data last night on hospital admissions, and we are heading into another wave. I don't know if it's the third or the fourth, and this delay has massively reduced where the peak of that wave in terms of hospital admissions is going to be. I think what a lot of scientists have argued is give it a few weeks, and then by that point, by July the 19th, 2/3 of the entire population will be double vaccinated, and something like 81% of adults. I do think that will make a big difference to the way everyone feels.
I mean, Jo, do you agree in terms of why it does seem to be very popular? We'll show our viewers this poll from YouGov, support for extension of COVID-19 restrictions in England, 71% majority support, only 24 oppose. Are you surprised by that?
Not overly. I mean, I think what's interesting is the same thing happened for me. I don't know what other people are experiencing, but it's been interesting that as the announcement came from the PM, within days, there were different people that I knew who suddenly had a case within their circle. And that is exactly what happened in December. So you almost you get a sense of within your own, if it's 6 degrees of separation or whatever, you get that sense of people suddenly who were being hospitalised, and it was a sense that things were getting worse. I'm not sure if people. I'm not sure. I am surprised that people.
But we know how effective the vaccine is. It's more effective than anybody possibly dreamt of, and there is a clear difference now, and that is the reason why hospital stays are mercifully very low, and that the small number of deaths is low and staying low. So we've got to have the courage to live with this.
Right, but whatever the psychology of it all, or the reasons behind it, Richard, it's clear that your party, the Reform Party, is languishing in the polls at sort of 2 or 3%, and that actually it seems the government and Labour, who also back the restrictions, are chiming with public opinion.
As I said earlier, I think half the public or more have been utterly terrified, and I saw this campaigning walking the streets, and I think that's a tragic way to govern a country by, with propaganda, to terrify a nation full of fear. Other countries who've been through this much more successfully, whether it's states in the US, whether it's the likes of Sweden and others, they haven't terrified the population. So you've got half the country that's terrified, half the country that's furious, and it's a massive job to bring people back, to lead the country back into self-belief and confidence. And we've got to get that process underway now.
Anushka?
Well, I think the point Richard is making, which is that the vaccination programme is great and will protect us, is right, but not quite yet. We're not quite at the levels where we get that protection that he's talking about, and we will be in a few weeks. And we've seen this in other countries. We've seen, for example, in Israel, while the vaccinations were rolling out, they had surges in infections. We saw it in Chile as well, places where vaccination programs are going really well. And the big thing to remember is that what the latest data has shown us on the Delta variant is that one jab on its own isn't anywhere near as effective as I think we were led to believe earlier.
But we must remember,
they'll come in a few weeks.
We have vaccinated all of the elderly, all of those at risk that we were told by ministers needed to be vaccinated, then we could cry freedom. And now we're bottling it. We're more terrified than ever.
Well, let's just show people pictures of angry protests, and they were angry earlier in the week. This was ahead of the vote, but it's about delaying the lifting of restrictions. Do you think, Hillary, the fact that mainstream opinion and the fact that the Labour Party, the main opposition party, has continued to back the government without a major challenge is pushing some people to the margins and out onto the streets?
Well, look, Joe, from the start of this, there have been a small number of people who've been in denial about the whole thing. People who write to us as MPs saying, oh, it doesn't exist, it's all lies, the hospitals are empty, and nonsense like that. And there is a parallel universe in which there is a giant conspiracy, which I think it reached the low point when it was claimed the government was trying to inject microchips into all of our arms. I mean, it's absurd. This has been a difficult problem for every country in the world to deal with. And we have to look at the science, we have to look at the facts, we have to look at the risks, we have to balance those. And at the start of the epidemic, and there are people who've been opposed to restrictions from the very beginning, you could see what the figures showed you about the risk. And the older you were, the greater the risk that if you got it and got seriously ill, you would die. And I find, talking particularly to older constituents, they have been observing the restrictions very carefully indeed, because it is about protecting yourself and your loved one. And it's all about striking the right balance. And I'm afraid views on at either end of the debate that say, it's all wonderful and we should carry on with it, and the whole thing is trying to terrify the population, doesn't do justice to the challenge that we are facing as a society in managing our way through this. And the vaccine gives us the best possible hope. But I agree with Anushka that a bit more time, because it's a race between vaccination and the new variants. And we just need to bear in mind, heaven forbid, if we were to get another variant that escapes the vaccine, we're going to be in real difficulty, which is why the world leaders should have been really applying their minds to how they're going to get vaccinations to all of the people in the world, because that reduces the risk of another variant that's going to trouble us all.
Do you agree you're on the margins then, Richard, with your views at the extreme?
No, I think the country is genuinely split, and whether it's 50-50,
well, why aren't you doing
40,
better then?
Because it's not actually about the parties, it's about people's belief about where this goes. But the goalposts have moved so far. Originally, it was vaccinate the over 70s, the vulnerable, then the over 50s, and now we're talking about vaccinating the whole world before anybody's safe. Other countries are having the courage to give confidence to their population that we need to learn to live with this. And that's that's the right thing. Otherwise, there'll always be variants. We know that's how viruses operate. There will always be variants. And the vaccines are effective against the variants. That's fantastic. But we have to learn to live with this and have the courage to do so.
And I don't think the government are not suggesting that we aren't going to have to live with this. I think that's categorically what they are saying. But a few weeks is a few weeks. I mean, they are fundamentally looking. There's been lots of reports actually about the Southwest, for example, being packed over half term, and rates therefore being affected. And this idea that then, there's more tourism, people that are moving around, people that are spending time with each other. It feels to me like the government are trying to get more vaccinations and then actually allow everyone to have a really decent summer holiday period. Hopefully, safe in the knowledge that then we won't end up with another variant.
It's always just a few more weeks, isn't it? And the goalposts move and move and move. And the language now has shifted.
But the virus
no one's
moves,
safe
Richard.
until everyone's safe.
This doesn't stand still, does it? This doesn't stand still.
But other countries, across the whole of Europe now, other countries are opening up and we're not. We're shutting down even more. And it's absurd.
All right, let's talk about Northern Ireland and catch up with BBC correspondent Dan Johnson, who is outside Stormont. A late-night deal to save the government. What's happened, Dan?
Absolutely, there was that deal here in the early hours of the morning, which seems to have progressed things because in the last few minutes, the new First Minister has been confirmed in his post. That is Paul Givan from the DUP. He will be joined by Deputy Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin, who will carry on in her post, having been reconfirmed here this morning. There'd been a deadlock for the last few days because Sinn Féin was refusing to support Paul Givan's nomination. But a deal was done between the parties here last night, overseen by the Northern Ireland Secretary Secretary Brandon Lewis. So things have progressed, and theoretically the parties can get back now to making the decisions that the people of Northern Ireland need, most pressingly on the pandemic and relaxing the restrictions as Northern Ireland moves out of lockdown. But there is a question about the level of support within the DUP for this nomination, because the leader, Edwin Poots, put forward Paul Givan, but the deal that he had to do last night doesn't seem to have gone down well with perhaps a majority of his own politicians here at Stormont and in Westminster as well. A lot of unease about the deal that's been done over promoting and protecting the Irish language here in Northern Ireland, perhaps seen by some of the DUP politicians as too much of a concession for Sinn Féin. So the official business is progressing here, but what it actually means in terms of politics and the power of the DUP in the days and weeks ahead is now a big question.
Right, so is there a question mark about how long it will hold for?
There certainly is, yes. There's talk that Paul Givan doesn't even have the support of more than 4 or 5 of his own politicians. So how long can he last in office as First Minister? How much decision-making will he actually be able to do? A huge question over that. We'll have to see what happens here. The hearing to swear him and Michelle O'Neill in has literally only just taken place. So what happens next in terms of the decision-making and the process? All eyes on Stormont. They do have big decisions to make about the COVID roadmap, decisions that were due to be taken here today anyway. So that pressured the parties into agreeing this deal and to get back to actually making decisions, because there are major issues to address about relaxing COVID restrictions, decisions that were due to be taken today, due to take effect next week. The parties didn't want to be seen to be missing in action on those sorts of major issues. But the deal that's been done to actually make this happen seems to have upset quite a lot of DUP politicians. And what that means for the level of support Paul Givan will actually now have in office is a huge question.
Thank you very much, Dan Johnson there at Stormont. Let's talk about the Labour Party, because a policy review is being launched today. It's called a policy roadmap. We can hear from Annalisa Dodds, who is in charge of that review.
It's been a dreadful time for so many people, but it's also shown that we can be stronger together. It's shown how neighbours have been able to work together to support elderly people, shown how our businesses have been able to work with trade unions, with the Welsh Government to create ventilators in really weeks when it normally would have taken months or even years. We've shown what we can do together. So this review, this roadmap, will be putting those principles into practice. And as I say, facing up to those big opportunities that we're just not seizing right now as a country.
Well, let's talk about the party's fortune. Hilary, you've been around a while, I hope you don't mind me saying, an MP since 1999.
Well, that's one way of putting it, yes.
And you're now on your 5th leader. Only 2 of those have been Prime Minister, as you know, and only 1 has won elections. How's the party get it right this time?
Well, I think we have to recognise, I mean, we're in a slightly difficult situation after the terrible election defeat of December 2019. And I think the lingering effects of that and the previous leadership can't be underestimated. Secondly, we've been in a pandemic, so normal politics hasn't really applied. The success of the vaccination programme. But look, as we come out of the pandemic, as we all hope we will, we need to ask ourselves some pretty fundamental questions about the kind of country that we are. Why are so many people having to go to food banks? Why is there so much in-work poverty? Why is there no plan for social care, which is the single biggest social challenge that we face, despite the Prime Minister's promise that he had one ready? How are we going to give communities real power over building the homes that are needed? And how are we going to make sure the net zero transition, which is coming, is fair to people? Now, these are all big practical questions, and we need to come forward with plans that shows that although this government has done things that the Tories would never normally have done because the pandemic has demanded it of them, paying a lot of people's wages, that isn't really where the heart of the Conservative Party lies, but using the power of government to try and improve lives for all people and to make a fairer country is what the Labour Party historically has all been about. And I think we will see the conversation change over time, but it's tough going at the moment. There's no pretending otherwise.
I mean, Anushka, Labour MP Darren Jones has described this as a Kodak moment for the party in reference to the American firm that almost collapsed as it transitioned to a digital world. Is that right?
Well, it definitely is the truth that the Labour Party was designed for the 20th century in terms of responding to the needs of Labour, you know, workers in the 20th century, and now it is something completely different that it is trying to respond to. And I think there are long-term structural problems that they have to try and deal with in terms of how everybody's world of work is changing and how the party can be there and represent people who are not perhaps unionised, for example, in the same way as they were 50 years ago, and how they can work with unions in this kind of new atmosphere. But there's also a short-term problem, isn't there, which is what Hillary's really talking about, which is that through all of what we're seeing at the moment, which has included really terrible death rates compared to the rest of the world, and which has included a former chief strategist for the Prime Minister coming out and telling us things which you almost can't believe the Conservative Party continue to do well in the polls. I think partly because they've hit, well, the vaccination programme, of course, but also they've hit this kind of sweet spot at the moment, which is that they fiscally have moved to the left, as Hillary was saying, spending all this money, for example, on propping up wages, etc., but that they're, you know, quite socially conservative as well. And it seems to work very well with voters. What Labour are trying to do with this, and I think it is very, very hard to translate this into kind of policies that people can actually grasp hold of, is to try and make the most of that communitarian spirit that we had at the beginning of the pandemic, and make the most of all the kind of local projects that are going on all around the country and that people are getting, you know, part of. And, you know, that's clearly what they're trying to do. It is very, very, very hard for them at the moment to get a hearing. The one thing to say is a lot changes. You know, 6 months ago, the conversation we were having was completely different to the one that we are having now. Yeah. And in a year's time, we might look back at this pandemic and not think first and foremost about the vaccine programme. We might think about other things, and we might think about the impact it's had on other areas of the NHS.
Okay. All right. I mean, you talk about conversation. The conversation may change, but the polls aren't changing, are they, Hillary? You say the depths plunged at the last election under Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Couldn't be underestimated. But if you look at the polls now, the average of polls in June, the Conservatives on 44%, Labour on 33%, and that is the average of the polls for both those main parties. Is Keir Starmer in a better position really than Jeremy Corbyn?
Oh, I definitely think he is in terms of the leadership that he presents, because Keir understands above all that the first thing that any party has to do is to win the trust and confidence of the British people. And I, having knocked on so many doors in that election, and I never want to hear again people say, I've always voted Labour, but. And that was the problem that we had, and that's why we went down to such a bad defeat. And that was about the leadership.
But the polls are still...
Well, I know, and it takes time. And Anushka is right. Circumstances come along, events change, new questions are asked. And what the policy review is about is making sure that the Labour Party is ready to provide the answers to the practical questions. Now, we are going to need a lot of technology to respond to net zero. But let's take a really practical problem, which a lot of people won't have been thinking about. If to get to net zero, all the gas boilers are eventually going to have to come out of people's homes. What's going to replace them? Who's going to make them? Great manufacturing opportunity for Britain. Great opportunity to fit, whether it's heat pumps or hydrogen boilers. And how do you do that and make sure that people who sometimes have trouble paying the gas bill are not faced with a bill to change the way in which they heat their home? Now, that is a really practical question that is in due course going to affect lots and lots of homes in the country. The government doesn't have a plan. It's up to us to come up with one.
The vast majority. But, Joe, I mean, you're a communications expert. Listening to this, and we're going to show our viewers the themes of this policy review. Better jobs and better work, a green and digital future, safe and secure communities, public services that work from the start, a future where families come first, Britain in the world. Is that going to transform Labour's fortunes? I mean, they're the headlines, but, you know...
I mean, the fundamental problem is, Anushka's right, things are going to keep moving. The problems that we're going to have to solve are going to keep moving. And actually, one of the big challenges a lot of the political parties have, but Labour probably struggle one of the worst on this, is this, you know, policies run by committee. And, you know, the NEC and the way that the policy...
Labour's really executive, yeah.
You know, there is a lot around those things that actually mean that you can be quite sluggish in being able to properly respond. And it's all very well having a line or two when you're at PMQs, or it's all very well having a line or two to camera, but you actually need something with some depth to it, because the public are going to at some point be looking at what the alternative is. One of the challenges that they've got in particular now is that when you are looking at the problem of the Conservative Party at the moment, the general view that I seem to find people say is, well, they haven't done a bad job. They've not done a bad job. Well, I'm not sure anyone else would have done any better. And the problem is, until they think that in the moment of a crisis, someone else would do better, I'm not sure what a policy review in itself really achieves. You have to be able to offer an alternative government. You have to be able to say, we would do it better. And that's going to be quite a hard thing to prove.
I mean, Anoushka, Ed Miliband, former Labour leader, has just written a new book called Go Big, arguing for a big, bold programme. Is Keir Starmer able to go big?
Well, I'm sure he is able to, but obviously we haven't seen it yet. We haven't seen policy, and policy is the thing that people can really grab hold of and say, well, this is what's going to happen to change my life. I think one of the things that's really difficult for the Labour Party, and increasingly difficult the further they are from power, is that what they need are people with gravitas. And the thing that often gives you gravitas just naturally is being in government. And so what they don't have so many of anymore, although I know there are a few around, for example, people who have sat in the cabinet and who therefore we look at and we automatically think that person has gravitas. And so it's a really hard thing to fix when you've been out of power for this long, to have people who the country look at and immediately think, yes, that's the person I want to listen to. Now, I'm not saying that the cabinet itself doesn't have its own problems in that way, but I think it is a challenge for the Labour Party. I noticed in terms of kind of going big, Annalisa Dodds was saying, well, every party comes up with a new policy. We're not just going to take things that were popular in 2017, for example. Yes, that is true. But I guess the question is, how long do people have to wait to see what those actual policies are, rather than concepts, which is what we're hearing about at the moment?
Well, Anoushka may have had you in mind, Hilary, someone with gravitas, as I said, somebody who is very experienced and been a serving cabinet minister. Would you like to return to the shadow cabinet, Hilary?
Look, it's for Keir to decide who he wants to serve. And I know it is, and I'm not going to speculate about that. But I would just point out, I mean, there are two types of elections. They're steady as she goes and time for a change. And you look back over the previous decades, and that's what you find. And in 1997, the public had made up its mind big time that it was time for a change. And the fact that many of the people who then went into those cabinet jobs had not been cabinet ministers before was not an obstacle to election victory. So it is, above all, it's about the circumstances and what is running with the mood of the country, because at that moment, people were tired of private affluence and public squalor. And that's why education, fixing the roofs of the leaking schools and textbooks and investing in the NHS and all of those things that we did were so popular. And it's about finding those issues for the future. And that's why I would start with what is still great inequality of opportunity in our country. That is what the Labour Party was founded to do something about.
Oh, Richard, you're not a neutral observer, but, you know, taking this in the round, it is difficult for any opposition in normal times, but we are in extraordinary times in a pandemic. Do you think Keir Starmer does have gravitas?
Actually, I do think he has gravitas, but I think the Labour Party got a real problem, which is that the Tories have basically moved on to their turf. They're now the party of big spending, high taxation, high regulation, traditional Labour ground. And I think the challenge for Labour is that they're talking about things in Westminster that ordinary potential Labour voters up and down the country, and I'm hearing on the doorstep, it's not what they think about, it's not what they talk about. So I think there's a huge disconnect. And unless Labour are very, very careful, they will go the way of the Liberals 100 years ago and never form a majority government in this country again.
All right, we're going to leave that discussion there. We're going to talk about something else. Have a listen to this.
Kevin, a hotel manager in Oxford, contacted me last week because he's worried. Because even if this country does open up in the next few weeks, he won't be able to run at full capacity due to chronic staff shortages. Local staff are leaving the industry because of the uncertainty caused by this government's bungled handling of this pandemic. The EU staff have already left because of the botched handling of Brexit, and he can't recruit from abroad because of the damaging new immigration policy. Will the government introduce a COVID recovery visa to help Kevin recruit the staff he desperately needs?
Was Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran talking about labour shortages in the hospitality industry. Other industries are facing similar problems with hiring staff. We can talk to Susanna Nicol, the Chief Executive of Build UK, the largest representative body in the construction industry. Welcome to you. Susanna, Layla Moran said the shortage of workers in hospitality is a result of both Brexit and COVID-19. Is that the experience in the building and construction industry?
It certainly is. And when we talk about labour, we're talking about people with appropriate skills and qualifications. We're not just talking about numbers. And we often underestimate the specialist knowledge and skills that industries need. And that's the same in construction. They're not skills that you can just gain overnight or hop from industry to industry. We're operating in a climate of limited availability of those skills where there is high demand. Certainly in construction, we've got big infrastructure projects across the UK. We've got high demand for housing. We've got a private sector with pent-up demand over the last 16 months. And we've got households with money to spend. And we've also got this government drive for building back better. So construction output is higher than ever before the pandemic. There's a number of factors here. We had a shortage of skills 2 years ago, just as the UK was beginning to gear up to prepare for Brexit. Then COVID hit, which has required everybody's energy and focus. Training in the workplace and colleges stopped for much of the lockdown, and a lot of those system changes we needed stopped as well.
So what would, I was just going to say, what would make recruitment easier then?
Well, first of all, we need to look at the immigration system, because at the moment it's not fit for purpose and it's not supporting businesses that are being asked to grow the economy and get the UK back on its feet.
Yes.
But we're not allowed to bring in the skills that we need from the EU. And I'm not saying do away with it completely.
Right.
It's about looking at what we need to build back better, to deliver the infrastructure in our country right here and right now.
Well, stay with us. Richard, should the government liberalise immigration rules?
No, far from it. I mean, this actually is good news, because it means that, guess what?
What, that people
in a free market, wages are going to go up. The lowest paid are going to earn more, whether it's in hospitality or other. That's good news. The other good news is firms are going to have to spend money training people, skilling people up. There are millions of students who are going to be leaving university, millions of students who are leaving school, and they now, in the UK, are going to get greater opportunities to get skilled, to get jobs. That is good news. So focus on young British people. I think that's great news. And then if there's a shortage, let's ease furlough. Stop people being on furlough. Get them back into work. This is good news. Wages are going to go up.
Right. Well, Susanna, it's good news rejecting your idea for recruitment. We've got the people here.
There's definitely the need to invest in the UK workforce, but that doesn't happen overnight. An apprenticeship, a minimum, is 12 months. You don't go from an apprenticeship to driving a piece of equipment on HS2 that's worth millions of pounds and needs a highly skilled operator. So the construction industry is investing in the UK workforce, but that is not something overnight. And construction projects are where they are. If you've got people on furlough down in Somerset and you've got vacancies up in Newcastle, I think it's a little bit tricky to match the two.
Well, Richard, do you accept that?
Well, I think the point about apprenticeships is that you're skilling up our local people, and I think that's good.
But what do you do in the meantime?
I accept it's going to take a bit of time, and wages will go up. That is the good, that is the good news, and people will retrain. They'll move to industries where they think there's more work. And yes, I've seen it campaigning. There's lots of building work going on, but that is good news. There's activity. Wages are going to go up, and I find it extraordinary that people in the Liberals or the Labour Party are complaining that there's a shortage of low-paid people. Let's lift furlough, get people back into work, and wages will rise, and that's a good thing, and firms must accelerate training of young people.
Right. Labour, what's your answer to Susanna? Hillary?
Well, look, of course we should be training people in this country, and the nation could do with a pay increase, and Labour is not a party of low pay, quite the reverse. But the government said when it passed the immigration bill, we will be flexible to meet the needs of the economy. And we're not really seeing that, are we? We spent the year and a half clapping the fantastic workforce in the NHS, and many of those doctors and nurses have brought their skills from other countries, and they're caring for our loved ones.
And so would you like more people to be coming in? Would you like more people to be coming in from abroad?
I think what this demonstrates is we now need to have the conversation as a nation. The Brexit argument was about the bit of immigration that it was said we couldn't control. Now it's entirely down to us. And if there are shortages of nurses, then I tell you, my constituents would say, well, if you need to issue more visas, please do that. And if there's shortage of construction workers, I mean, I've got a lot of constituents who are living in unsafe buildings because of the cladding crisis. Replacing that cladding, fixing the fire safety defects is going to take a lot of workers. And it's important that we are able to do that quickly, because for people to wake up every morning again to find out or to be reminded that they're living in a fire risk is not good for anybody. So it's about striking a balance of both of these things.
But at the moment, you would like more visas to bring people in who could fill those vacancies in the construction industry, for example.
If that's what's needed to prevent shortages, then it's down to the government to bring forward proposals, and we will look at them.
Right. Joe, what do you think? Should the government now be focusing on bringing in talent from overseas to deal with the problem that Susanna said, or are you with Richard in the sense that we should be focusing on people here because there are plenty of job vacancies and training them up?
I think fundamentally there has to be a mix of the two. Because
have they got the balance wrong, the government?
Well,
do you think?
it doesn't feel like the balance is quite right yet. I mean, there's definitely a sense of that there has to be a group that have basically left certain types of jobs simply because those jobs were perhaps seen as unstable. Because, you look at something like hospitality. Who would have ever thought that all the pubs or all the restaurants would ever shut in a country? You would never, ever have foreseen that. So the casual labour, the people that, for instance, some of those jobs are the things that equip people to do other stuff. They're the people that build their careers off of those. They fund their university studies, for example. So there are people that were doing those jobs, and as their lives return to normal, they will go back to university towns, for example, where they used to live and they used to work in the local restaurant or the local pub. So those people will return as life gets back to normal. I don't think that is necessarily a visa issue. That's partly because of the times that we're living in. But there are, the construction industry has been talking about skills shortages for decades. There have been problems around people getting into, 20 years ago, we were talking about how vocational jobs, because of the obsession with going to university, we stopped actually training young people. In Germany, you get 14-year-olds who work on, production lines. They know about engineering by the time they leave school. We haven't had that mentality here. So it's a very different approach that we've had in this country.
And the reason was it was too easy to bring in cheap, skilled construction labour from elsewhere rather than train our own people.
That wasn't the only reason.
A huge opportunity.
But Richard, also parents didn't necessarily value those jobs. Some parents thought, oh, do you know what? I don't want my child to get their hands dirty. I want them to go to university and do something else. And we have to change a mindset. It's not just about, it can't always just be about immigration. It can't always just be about a Brexit argument. It's actually about fundamentally the attitudes changing to the jobs that we have here, and actually the fact that we should value all of them.
Right, Anushka, some of this is feeding through in inflation, because you will have seen, no doubt, yesterday it's now at 2.1%, so just above the Bank of England target. Do you think that is a danger politically if inflation continues to rise?
I mean, certainly if it continues to rise, not least because of the conversations we're having about people's wages and them falling further and further behind if inflation continues to increase. So, for example, conversations about how much we should be paying people in the NHS become increasingly difficult in that way. I mean, I think Jo has made this point, hasn't she? But from what everyone's saying, it's clearly not an either or here. It's a mix of all of the above. But it is quite worrying when you think back 20 years and realise that the same conversations we're having then as they're having now. And, we haven't yet filled these skill shortages in other ways. And we haven't yet fixed the problem that Jo is talking about as towards the kind of way that there is this divide in education between, the academic side of it and the more vocational side of it. And so I think, although I do understand why there are needs for visas right now in certain industries, and clearly the immigration system should be there to try and help fix shortages in particular industries, I also despair at the fact that we keep having the same conversation over and over again, and yet we don't seem to find long-term solutions.
All right, just briefly, Susanna, we haven't got long. Are you seeing inflationary pressures in the construction industry?
We certainly are, particularly on materials as well. And again, it's a similar problem, and it's a global issue as well. Limited availability alongside significant demand for raw materials and products. And so, yes, we are seeing cost increases.
All right.
You're actually not able to get hold of some materials as well, which actually has a significant impact on many of the projects across the UK.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.